In 1944, Paul Block Jr. took control of the newspaper his father had bought in the 1920s, the Toledo Blade. Paul Block decided almost immediately to begin a project that would reimagine the city of Toledo's future, a city that Jessup Scott had once called the future great city of the world. He contracted with one of the most famous designers in America, Norman Bel Geddes, to imagine what the pair called Toledo Tomorrow. In so many ways, Toledo Tomorrow sparked a conversation about what Toledo ought to look like after the World War. Some of their wild visions came true, others didn't, but the ambitious vision gave all Toledoans a chance to think about what the city could be instead of what the city was. You know, a lot of times when people think of civic treasures or civic institutions in the city of Toledo, we immediately go with the art museum and the zoo. I really encourage you guys to think of the Toledo Blade as a really important civic institution in the city of Toledo. And as I said when I was standing in front of the Blade building talking about Paul Block, the Block family, from Paul Block Sr. to Paul Block Jr. to the brothers that operate the paper now, they really created an incredible civic institution in this city where you can argue whether it's been for good or bad, but what you cannot argue, they have steered the public discourse in the city to a large degree. And that's the real importance of what Paul Block Jr. did with Toledo Tomorrow. So let's talk a little bit about this plan and how it played out. So when people thought about Toledo Tomorrow, Toledo after the war, there was kind of planning going on in general anyways, like immediate near-term planning. So people were trying to envision what the city needed after the war. Because the war itself, first you had the Depression for 10 years, right? And then you've got the war itself putting great stress on the entire city, putting stress on the housing market, stress on relations among people, stress on the utilities, the infrastructure. And there were real questions about how you build a city that survives after what Toledo had been through over the 15, 16 years from October of 1929 and the beginning of the Depression to September of 1945 and the end of the Second World War. So one of the big things was that housing was in short supply. There were not enough houses for people. People were doubling up in houses. The city made these absurd requests to people like, your children have moved out. You have spare rooms? Why not invite another family to live with you? And while that's certainly a charitable thing to do, that is not a long-term plan for housing in a city. So they had to find a way to build new housing in the city. Another big worry was jobs. People worried about whether the economy was going to just fall apart again. And we'll talk about that more in just a bit. People also worried about the jobs that they had. Are we going to lose them? Women who were working in the factories, African-American people who were working in the factories, older people who were working in the factories. I've been doing this job. I've proved I can do this job. I've done this job better than anybody's ever done this job. Am I just going to get laid off and never be able to work again when the servicemen come back to their jobs? There are lots of questions about jobs and lots of anxiety. And then finally, the biggest one, race relations, are an enormous concern. Racism in Toledo, I think it's really interesting to note. And keep in mind, this is just kind of my amateur observation based on the book and based on having read a number of primary sources over the years. There was not a ton of racism in Toledo in the 1800s, and I think we can kind of attribute that to there weren't a lot of African-American people in Toledo in the 1800s. Then we start getting the neighborhood on Pinewood, and the black population grows, and for the most part, you don't see a lot of overt racism until the 1920s. And then you start getting some real gross, disgusting racism showing up with cross burnings and Klan meetings and that kind of stuff. Then the Depression hits, and in a lot of ways that racism subsides because everyone is in such a, disaster mentality that just kind of falls by the wayside to a large part. Then as the war goes on, we see racism rearing its ugly head again in really big ways. One of the big fights was about public housing that the city wanted to build out by what is today Detweiler Park, which we'll talk about Detweiler Park again in a minute. But out that way, the city wanted to build some public housing for African American families. White families in Point Place lost their minds about this. And this was back and forth for 2 years. Before finally the city just gave up. Now, obviously, you guys know how the story ends, and you know that there is a lot of public housing off of Summit going up towards Suter and Manhattan Boulevard today. And we know that there are African American families who live up that way in large numbers. But at the time, people were losing their minds about that. And we saw it throughout the city. We talked already about Jake Chandler, the first African American patrolman. We talked about William Needger Thomas, who tries to become a teacher in TPS and is told flat out, sorry, we already have X number of black teachers, we don't need any more. Race relations were a huge concern going into the post-war era in Toledo. The critical figure in this, as I mentioned at the very outset, is Paul Block Jr. And Paul Block Jr. is a fascinating historical character to me. Paul Block Jr. is a trained chemist. He is a scientist. And he inherited the blade with his brother when their father died in 1940, I want to say 1941. This says 1942, but I'm thinking Paul Block Sr. died in 1941. But either way, their father dies in the early 40s, near the very beginning of the war, very beginning of the United States involvement in the war. And the Block brothers, who are quite young, in their 20s at the time, inherit the paper. Paul Block Jr. had been trained in the paper over the years by his father, but his real passion lay in chemistry. And this guy is a world-class scientist. If you look up Paul Block Jr. in chemistry, you're going to find a ton of hits because he was a really gifted scientist, really gifted laboratory scientist. But he also knew the news business. During this interim between when his father dies and when he takes kind of day-to-day control of the paper in 44, Paul Block Jr. is working on his graduate coursework at Yale. And when he comes back to Toledo, he's really going to pour himself into the newspaper, even though he's going to maintain a private science lab at his home where he still carries out really cutting-edge experiments throughout the rest of his life. Paul Block Jr. takes the paper's reins in 44, and he's looking to make a splash immediately. I personally think, as I read things about him, he's trying to assert himself, right? His dad was a very larger-than-life figure, but his dad was kind of in and out of Toledo. His dad had lived in New York and is kind of in and out of Toledo. And I think Paul Block Jr. was maybe trying to really carve out an identity for himself. And he decides he's going to be all in as the Toledo newspaper editor. And he brings kind of a new, young vision to the paper and to the city. So, Paul Block Jr. enters into a contract with this guy, Norman Bell Geddes. Now, first of all, the guy's real last name is Geddes. He added the Bell as almost like an affectation, like to make himself seem more glamorous instead of being Norm Geddes. It's Norman Bell Geddes. Which frankly is an awesome name. I'm not going to throw stones at the guy. If you know anything about him, you might know, if you're a Star Wars fan, if you remember Episode 4, when Luke is growing up with Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru is Norman Bell Geddes' daughter, Barbara Bell Geddes. So Norman Bell Geddes was born just outside of Toledo not just outside of Toledo, but about an hour away in Adrian, Michigan. And then he had relatives that lived in Toledo, and he lived and worked as a kid in the city of Toledo for a while. And Bell Geddes becomes really famous as a designer, as a set designer for Broadway shows. He's creating the sets that take people to a different place in the theater. But over time, he becomes known as kind of a futurist, the kind of person who tries to envision a new future and everything. And one of the biggest things he does is something called Futurama at the New York World's Fair. If you've seen Captain America, the First Avenger, and you remember when Steve and Bucky and the girlfriends go to this place with all these different demonstrations, and Howard Stark is demonstrating a car that's supposed to float, and Steve finally gets accepted into the military. That was a takeoff of this World's Fair. Just this giant Cedar Point-like exhibition trying to imagine the future. And Bell Geddes designs this pavilion for GM called Futurama, trying to imagine what is a city going to look like in the far out 1950s and 60s. Bel Geddes, after that, just has this stellar reputation for being the guy you go to if you want to imagine what the future looks like. Block manages to get him under contract, and I really can't stress to you guys enough, this is a really big flippin' deal. Getting Norman Bel Geddes to come to your town and design something, this is getting the rock star of his age, the impresario of his age, to come to Toledo, Ohio and do something. And that's a pretty big deal. So Paul Block Jr. convinces Norman Bel Geddes to come and envision what could the city of Toledo look like 20 or 30 years down the road. And throughout the war, Bel Geddes had been designing these panoramas of the war, models of the battlefields that they could then zoom over with a camera, because back then you didn't have the same kind of aerial photography, and you didn't have the same graphic arts abilities. So Bel Geddes was helping Americans kind of know what the war looked like in their own homes. The plans that they come up with, I love this picture so much. So let's talk about the picture first. This is so cool. So if you look up here, I have my finger in the Maumee River right now. And I believe if I point up that way, like if I go any further, I'm going to put my hand off the screen. So I'll use the pointer tool now. Right here is the high-level bridge, the Anthony Wayne Bridge that connects South Toledo and East Toledo. And this is where Route 2 comes across the river. So that's the high-level bridge. Right here, behind this kid's head, is the Cherry Street Bridge, the Martin Luther King Bridge that connects downtown and the east side. And then over here is what used to be the bridge that went from Consol to Galena Street. So this was like North Toledo to Birmingham. This would be Birmingham right here, like Tony Packo's is right there and stuff. And then they envisioned a new bridge that goes right over the top of my bald head that was going to be a double layer bridge with cars on top and railroads on the bottom, which is kind of awesome. And that was going to be part of this network of highways that we're going to link Cleveland and Toledo and Detroit, which today you know is the Ohio Turnpike. So anyways, that's to try and orient you. So these plans for the entire city of Toledo, downtown being right here, east side being right here, South Toledo, how did it become a triangle? We'll talk about that in a minute. Bel Geddes realized that the future was in air traffic, that railroads are a thing of the past. Cars, he thought, were going to be a big part of the future, but he really saw air travel as how people were going to get around. So Bel Geddes plans out having 5 airports in the city of Toledo. Now, as you are probably aware, right now we have 0 airports within the city limits of Toledo. So let's talk about how that happened. Their first big idea was a big cargo airport near Manhattan and Summit. And at the beginning of this, I talked about Detweiler Pool. One of these airports was going to be right where like Detweiler is today, and the city, like Bayview Retirees Golf Course. That was going to be a big cargo airport. Then they thought lots of people were going to fly small planes just to get from place to place. So they made private plane airports, one of which was going to be near Lake High School. And that had been Toledo's airport prior to the war. And that airport is still there today. We call it Toledo Executive. Those of us who are a little bit older still call it Metcalf Field. But that was still going to be one of Toledo's airports, but only for small planes out by Lake High School. Another airport was going to be at Glendale and Eastgate. So not too far away from Maumee Valley Country Day School, and exactly where, if you know where Monette's Market is and Rudy's Hot Dog, exactly where Rudy's Hot Dog is where this airport would have kind of spread out to the south and east of the intersection of Glendale and Eastgate, going into Swan Creek Metro Park a little bit. The third private plane airport was going to be up at Lasky and Jackman. So basically like Bowman Park and Start High School, that was going to be the final of these private plane airports. Now, the big airport where people would fly in and out of on passenger jets, that was going to be right here next to the high-level bridge. If you look at, this is downtown. That right there is downtown. That's it. This was going to be an airport bigger than downtown by basically bulldozing the entire Old South End. Bel Geddes' vision was, at that point, the Old South End is where the Irish had lived, and it was all run down. The Irish had moved out of the neighborhood. It's super run down. Bel Geddes' vision is, these places are a bunch of derelict houses, like the whole Immaculate Conception neighborhood around Broadway. Demolish all of it, everything. And basically it was going to go all the way up to where Danny Thomas Park is now. So if you know the Old South End, imagine from Danny Thomas Park all the way to High Level Bridge, flattened for an airport. Bel Geddes' idea was not entirely crazy. Sometimes we call this area right here, we call it the Middle Grounds, where Swan Creek comes out into the Maumee River, and Owens Corning's headquarters is, and then you got the bridge, and then you got what is today the Middle Grounds Metro Park right over there. That historically, the reason Toledo became a really prominent city was that our city is where the canals, the railroads, and a river that went out to the Great Lakes all came together. And they all came together at the Middle Grounds. And if you've heard of the Warehouse District before, like where the Mud Hen Stadium is, the Warehouse District became a wealthy part of town because a canal boat brings stuff. They put it in a warehouse, then they load it on a ship a couple days later. Those warehouses where you kept stuff while it was in transit between other places, those warehouses became a source of wealth and revenue for the city of Toledo. Bel Geddes basically reimagines the Middle Grounds, just as they had been a place where multiple modes of transportation came together in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. Bel Geddes says, why not have it be a place where all modes of transportation come together in the middle of the 20th century, by the 1950s and 1960s. So that's his great big airport. And right there is the terminal of the airport, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. That terminal was not just going to be an airport terminal. This is a picture of it, an artist's imagination of it from Life magazine. You see this giant building that says Toledo on top. That's so as you flew over in your airplane, making your approach to land, you would see Toledo written as big as life on the top of this thing. So, the big idea with this new terminal, if you guys remember, all of the soldiers in World War II complained about how lousy Toledo's train station was. And they still had that lousy train station in 1945 when Toledo Tomorrow was going to debut. The idea was exactly where our train station is today. If you've ever been down there on Emerald Avenue, we're going to have not just a train station, but a plane station. The trains, if you look at this picture is a cutaway, and it's showing that the entire airport would be built over the train tracks. The airport would be the second level of the structure. Planes would land on the roof of the train station. All of that area, all the way out to Danny Thomas Park, all of that stuff is going to be the second level. Trains come in below. Planes, you can see the tail of a plane right there. Planes land on these runways that are really the roof of the whole thing. Then people go down, they get off the plane. I'm trying to find my cursor. They get off the plane, they go down an elevator to the other level, and then they go into the terminal to get their baggage and whatnot. That trains and planes would all come together in this one terminal. It's such a cool idea. I wish it had worked so bad, except for the fact that it would have destroyed a really, really cool neighborhood, which would have been a tragedy. But the audacity of this plan is just amazing. It's the kind of thing I love, because it's like, oh, that took some guts to come up with a plan like that. Now, here's what I don't like. One of the other big plans that Bel Geddes had was demolishing an entire neighborhood. And it was a really cool neighborhood, and it no longer exists for reasons we'll talk about later. There was a neighborhood on the east side. If you can imagine getting on Front Street, driving past Waite High School towards Birmingham, and then keep driving north, keep driving towards the lake. There was another neighborhood past Birmingham called Ironville. And Ironville had been a thriving neighborhood, mostly Czech people. The Czechoslovakian people had moved there. And if you guys know where Holy Rosary, the former Holy Rosary Parish is, off of Wheeling, Holy Rosary was the church that served a lot of the people in Ironville. The picture that you're looking at is Irving School. This was the school that served Ironville up until the 1960s. Bel Geddes said, Ironville's trash. Let's flatten that neighborhood too. Just like South Toledo, Old South End, let's flatten Ironville. And what we're going to do, back in the 1940s, the entire riverfront in Toledo was disgusting. Okay? It's where the docks were because you unloaded stuff and it went to the businesses. So it made sense for it to be disgusting, but it was still disgusting nevertheless. So Bel Geddes' plan says, we're just going to pave over this whole neighborhood and we're going to move all the dirty, heavy industry that had been on the riverfront downtown, we're going to move it all to the northeast side, which is, of course, exactly what happened and why most of you don't even know there was a neighborhood called Ironville, because Ironville is all the shipyard and the docks and the new steel plant that's super tall. All of that stuff is out there exactly on the footprint of where this thriving neighborhood was. The other thing that's part of Bel Geddes' plan is bulldozing other entire neighborhoods throughout the city, especially on the north of downtown, like today where Channel 11 is and the parking lots across from Channel 11 and the apartment buildings up Cherry Street from the river to like St. Vincent's Hospital. Blocks and blocks of older homes are going to be destroyed. Just destroy everything. And in their place, we're going to build apartment buildings. Bel Geddes believed the future was cars, planes, apartments for everybody. For ground transit, Bel Geddes saw this network of highways. So what you're looking at in this picture, this is the current high-level bridge, the Anthony Wayne Bridge that goes from South Toledo over to the east side, carries Route 2, becomes Woodville Road on the east side. And you see that Woodville Road becomes this massive traffic circle where the highway that is going to replace Woodville Road goes over the top, and then underneath there's this circular road that kind of carries what I'm guessing is Oak Street underneath here as a boulevard. Then there's a highway along the east side. What you see here is where the Doc's restaurants are today. He wanted that to be parkland and for this to be a farmer's market on the east side. On the west side of the river, you see there's a major highway that goes right up along the river's edge. This west side highway, the West Parkway. Then there's another huge highway that's basically where Monroe Street is that comes in. And then Route 2, since it doesn't just end at the end of the bridge and become Broadway going off here, Route 2 was going to angle off onto the Anthony Wayne Trail. That there was going to be this sweeping curve onto the Anthony Wayne Trail, and the trail would make up the edge of this massive airport, train port, whatever you want to call it. The other thing Bel Geddes called for was parkland all along the river. He said, your riverfront is being wasted. You need parks along the river, over here by the bridge. You need parks over here near where Swan Creek empties into the river. You need parks along the west bank, parks along the east bank. And that's kind of what we have happening right now, right? We are starting to have parks. In your lifetime, we're starting to have parks in these places Bel Geddes called for 75 years ago. He also said the rail lines in town, there were too many railroads. So he said, we're going to consolidate the rail lines. A whole bunch of them near Libby on the south end at Airline Junction. A whole bunch more in East Toledo near the border with Rossford, which is, in those cases, exactly where they all ended up. The demonstration at Toledo tomorrow was one of the biggest events that Toledo City has ever seen. This is the front page from July 3rd, the day before Toledo Tomorrow debuts, and you see the entire front page of the Blade. It's not about anything happening in the war, which, P.S., the war is still going on. The front page of the paper is all Toledo Tomorrow is here. Citizens to see master plan of their post-war community. Toledo Tomorrow creator, once Toledo grocery boy. Transportation key to planning. Eyes of the nation on Toledo Tomorrow. This was a big deal. Hundreds of thousands of people walked through a building at the zoo. What you guys might remember is the zoo museum where Santa Claus always was when you were kids and the trains were set up at Christmas time. The Zoo Museum is where Toledo Tomorrow was set up. It was enormous. It ate up all the floor in there, and there was a raised walkway so people could walk around and see what Toledo Tomorrow looked like. Toledoans ate this stuff up. They loved it. The reaction to Toledo Tomorrow is overwhelmingly positive. Toledoans wanted a new modern city. They were sick of what they perceived as an old dirty city. Now, I'm sitting here in the year 2020. You know what I want? I want to go back to that city. I want to see what that city was like when you still had shopping downtown and everybody walked everywhere and you could take a streetcar. I want that more than I think they wanted the future at that point. Now, over time, very little of Toledo Tomorrow got implemented. Housing did get demolished. And if you look around the city, like along Dorr Street, along Cherry Street, going out Summit, there are huge neighborhoods that got flattened and replaced with apartment buildings or duplexes. Ironville was flattened, and that's this picture behind here. The street that starts at the bottom and continues through the notes there is Millard Avenue. And today, if you know anything about Millard, you know that it's got like a junkyard on one side and a factory on the other. You can still see what was left of the neighborhood streets of Ironville in the background here. It was a thriving neighborhood, and we bulldozed it to just put in all this industrial stuff. Now, I'm not going to argue that was a good or a bad thing, because I think there were really good parts to it, but there's also just this shame of you took this whole neighborhood and all these hundreds of people and said, your neighborhood doesn't matter. We're throwing you out. And that's to me just seems really sad. Ironville was flattened. Docks and heavy industry did move there, and it opened up the riverfront downtown for the parks that we're starting to enjoy, like Middle Grounds Metro Park, like International Park near the Docks restaurants. Across the river, you got Promenade Park near the ProMedica headquarters. You've got the new East Side Metro Park, Glass City Metro Park coming to the east side. Like, we're finally starting to do some of these things that Norman Bell Geddes envisioned 75 years ago. Now, one of the other things he envisioned was that downtown we would have super wide streets and lots of parking lots. And people at the time thought that was a good thing. Today, when I go downtown Toledo, one of the things that always makes me sad is how many buildings are gone and there's just surface parking lots there that are empty half the time. Then the other thing that happens out of this, everybody agreed we needed a new airport, but nobody wanted to see it in their neighborhood. Nobody wanted planes flying over them. So they fight and fight and fight and fight over maybe moving the entire airport up to Detweiler, maybe keeping the entire airport where Bell Geddes wanted it in the old South End, maybe moving the entire airport project out towards Manette's Market and Maumee Valley Country Day School. Finally, they agree, we don't want it anywhere near the city. And in what, in my personal opinion, is one of the dumbest decisions made in Toledo history, they were like, I got an idea. Let's put the Toledo airport like 20 miles outside of Toledo. And they agreed to put the airport all the way out in Swanton. And you guys, I can tell you, when I used to work before I was a teacher in different occupations, we would have people fly in to see us, and they would be like, why is your airport like 20 miles? It took me like a half hour to get down to your office from your airport. What's going on here? Like, our airport made us a joke. And a lot of that came from these fights that came out at Toledo Tomorrow about where our airport should be and who should have to sacrifice their neighborhood for it. So that kind of ends our discussion of Toledo Tomorrow, because we're living in Toledo tomorrow. We're living in Toledo today. I hope this was interesting to you guys. I love this kind of stuff. And if we had more time this year, I would ask you to design your own Toledo Tomorrow. And maybe we'll do that in second semester in Toledo Past, Present, Future. So thanks a lot for sticking with me, guys. Be well.